The rain over Atlanta fell in a fine, persistent mist, the kind that doesn't soak you immediately, but seeps into your bones over time. It slicked the asphalt of the North DeKalb Mall parking lot, turning the strobing red and blue of police lights into a bleeding, chaotic watercolor. Detective Ethan Park killed the engine of his unmarked sedan, the silence in the car a stark contrast to the low thrum of generators and hushed, urgent voices outside. He took a moment, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and watched the scene unfold. This was the part of the job that never got easier, the moment before you stepped out of your own world and into someone else's ending. The initial call had been a mess of teenage panic and garbled words. A 911 dispatcher, her voice strained, had relayed the fragmented report. "There's a cop. He's yelling. He's got a gun on a car." By the time the first patrol cars arrived, the yelling had stopped. It had been replaced by a silence more terrifying than any scream. Ethan pulled the collar of his trench coat tighter and stepped into the damp night air. The smell hit him first, a coppery metallic tang cutting through the wet earth scent of the nearby woods. A young officer with wide, haunted eyes stood guard at the yellow tape, his face pale under the harsh floodlights. He recognized Ethan and simply nodded, his jaw tight. "It's bad, detective. Real bad." "Give me the basics," Ethan said, his voice low as he ducked under the tape. "Two deceased, one male, one female, both in the vehicle." The officer gestured toward a silver Honda Civic parked awkwardly at the far, desolate edge of the lot, a place where teenagers went to make out and drug deals went down. "The shooter, he didn't run. He was just standing there when we rolled up." Ethan followed the officer's gaze. There, sitting on the wet curb, wrapped in a thermal blanket, was the shooter. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his head bowed so low his chin touched his chest. He was a statue of despair, a monument to a single, life-shattering moment. But it wasn't just any man. It was Officer Elijah Harris. Not just an officer, but the officer. The face of the APD's community outreach program. The man who mentored at-risk kids on weekends. The decorated hero who'd pulled a family from a burning car on the I-285 just last year. A golden boy. A pillar. The other cops moved around the scene with a strange, heavy reverence. They avoided looking directly at Elijah, as if his disgrace were contagious. It was the blue wall, that invisible shield of brotherhood, cracking under a pressure it was never meant to withstand. They were investigators at a homicide, but they were also brothers looking at a fallen angel. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a wake. Ethan approached the Honda. The forensics team was already at work, their movements precise and detached. Through the driver's side window, which was spiderwebbed from a bullet hole, he could see the interior. It was a tableau of violence frozen in time. A woman, her head slumped against the passenger side window, her vibrant dress a cruel splash of color in the grim scene. A man in the driver's seat, motionless. The air inside the car felt thick, heavy with the finality of it all. Ethan recognized the woman instantly from police charity events and department picnics. Simone Harris. Elijah's wife. A graphic designer with a laugh that could fill a room and a smile that seemed to generate its own light. Now, that light was extinguished. His chief, a weary veteran named Captain Miller, intercepted him. "Park," he said, his voice gravelly. "This one's yours." Ethan didn't react, but inside, a knot tightened in his stomach. He was one of the department's best homicide detectives, but he was also an outsider, an Asian American in a department and a city where the lines of race and loyalty were drawn in thick, complex strokes. Giving him this case was a calculated move. He had no personal ties to Elijah Harris. He was objective, impartial, a scalpel in a situation that required surgical precision. "He's not talking," Miller continued, rubbing his face. "Just sits there, mumbles, says he doesn't remember, claims he blacked out." A blackout. The oldest defense in the book, second only to, "It wasn't me." Ethan had heard it 100 times. It was the desperate gasp of a mind trying to distance itself from an act too monstrous to comprehend. He looked back at Elijah, who was now being helped to his feet by 2 officers, his movements stiff and robotic. The hero of Atlanta, now just another suspect in a jumpsuit, his face a mask of hollow shock. How does a man like that, a man who built his life on a foundation of discipline and control, shatter so completely? Ethan walked the perimeter of the scene, his eyes scanning every detail: the scattered glass, the chalk outlines already being drawn, the two teenagers, the ones who made the call, huddled in the back of a squad car, their faces pressed against the window, watching the grim theater. They were the overture to this tragedy. But the main act, the real story, was hidden in the silent spaces between the facts. It was in the years of a marriage he knew nothing about, in the life of the unknown man in the driver's seat, and in the dark corners of a hero's mind. He knew this case would be more than a simple whodunit. The who was sitting right over there, stripped of his badge and his dignity. The real mystery was the why. Why this man? Why this woman? Why tonight? He looked from the broken body of Simone Harris in the car to the broken spirit of her husband on the curb. The distance between them was only about 20 feet of wet pavement, but it was also a chasm of secrets, betrayals, and rage that had finally, violently overflowed. The city would see a fallen hero. The department would see a tarnished badge. But Ethan Park knew his job was to look past all of that, to find the man behind the myth. And he had a sinking feeling that the man he was about to uncover was a stranger to everyone, most of all to himself. The interrogation room at Atlanta Police Headquarters was a sterile beige box designed to suffocate emotion. The air tasted of stale coffee and disinfectant. There were no windows, only a one-way mirror that felt like a void staring back. In this vacuum, Detective Ethan Park sat across from the shell of Officer Elijah Harris. Hours had passed since the shooting. The sun was rising over a city that would soon wake up to the news of its hero's fall from grace. Elijah had been processed, stripped of his uniform, and dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow his large frame, making him look smaller, diminished. He hadn't said a word since his initial, "I don't remember." He just stared at the metal table, his hands now free of cuffs, resting limply in his lap. His knuckles were raw, not from a fight, but from clenching his fists so hard the skin had broken. Ethan let the silence stretch, a tactic he often used. Silence was a container. Eventually, people felt compelled to fill it, often with the truth. But Elijah's silence was different. It wasn't defiant. It was empty. A chasm. "Elijah," Ethan began, his voice calm, measured. "I'm Detective Park. I'm leading this investigation. I need you to talk to me. Tell me what happened tonight." Elijah's head lifted slowly. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, as if he were looking at something 1,000 miles away. "Park," he whispered, his voice raspy. "They sent you." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of resignation. They sent the outsider, the one who wouldn't be swayed by years of shared shifts and off-duty beers. "I need to know your side of the story," Ethan pressed gently, placing a digital recorder on the table. "Start from the beginning of your shift." Elijah blinked, a long, slow motion, as if forcing his brain to reboot. "Shift was normal," he began, the words coming out in a flat monotone. "Routine patrol in Zone 3, a domestic dispute on Edgewood, a fender bender on Memorial Drive, nothing." He spoke like he was reading an incident report, the details scrubbed clean of any human feeling. "And after your shift?" "I was heading home, driving west on Ponce." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the table. "I saw her car, Simone's car, parked at the mall. She was supposed to be at her sister's place in Decatur. Said she was helping with the kids." The first lie. Ethan made a mental note. "So you decided to stop?" "Just to check," Elijah said, a flicker of something, defensiveness, in his eyes. "To see if everything was okay. Her car, it's been having battery trouble." It was a plausible explanation, the kind a loving husband would give, but it felt rehearsed, a flimsy shield for a much darker impulse. "You walked up to the car. What did you see?" This was the moment. The chasm opened up again. Elijah's breathing became shallow. He squeezed his eyes shut. "It's foggy," he stammered. "I remember the rain on the windshield, the way the light from my flashlight scattered. I looked inside." He swallowed hard. "And then, nothing. It's just gone. The next thing I remember is the sound of sirens, and I'm on the ground, and my hands feel wrong." He looked down at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger who had committed an unspeakable act, a perfect, complete blackout of the most critical moment. It was too clean, too convenient. Ethan had seen genuine fugue states before, brought on by trauma, by extreme psychological distress. They were messy, fragmented. The memories didn't just vanish, they splintered, returning in nightmarish flashes. Elijah's version was a neat, surgical removal of guilt. You don't remember opening the car door, Elijah? You don't remember the argument? The gunshots? No, he whispered, shaking his head. I swear to God I don't. I just remember seeing them, him and her, in the car together. And then, white noise, a loud screaming noise in my head. His performance was flawless. The vacant stare, the trembling hands, the voice choked with a grief that could be for his wife or for himself. It was impossible to tell. Ethan knew he was facing one of two possibilities. Either Elijah Harris was a man so broken by betrayal that his mind had snapped to protect him, or he was a cold, calculating killer already building the foundations of an insanity defense. Ethan decided to change tactics. Who was the man in the car, Elijah? Did you know him? Never seen him before in my life, Elijah answered, this time without hesitation. The answer was too quick. There was a hard edge to his voice, a flicker of the anger that he was trying so hard to bury beneath the shock. Simone, Ethan continued, watching Elijah's face for any reaction. Had things been difficult between you two lately? A bitter, humorless smile touched Elijah's lips. Every marriage has its seasons, detective. We were in a winter. The poetry of the phrase was jarring in the stark, ugly context of a double homicide. It was another layer of performance, the articulate, thoughtful man peeking through the facade of the amnesiac brute. For 2 hours, Ethan circled, probed, and pushed. He asked about their finances, their friends, their last family vacation. With every question, Elijah retreated further into his fog of non-memory, offering only vague, disconnected fragments. He was a fortress, and the walls were built of silence and denial. Ethan knew he wouldn't get anything more from him today. The trauma, real or feigned, was too fresh. The truth, whatever it was locked away tight. As 2 uniformed officers came to lead Elijah back to his holding cell, he stopped at the door and looked back at Ethan. The vacant expression was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading look. "You have to believe me, Park," he said, his voice cracking. "I love my wife. I couldn't." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The unspoken word, kill, hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Ethan sat alone in the silent room for a long time after Elijah was gone. He replayed the entire interview in his head, searching for the tells, the cracks in the armor. He'd found a few, the flash of anger, the rehearsed excuses, the poetic deflections. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He looked at the one-way mirror, knowing Captain Miller and a dozen other department brass were likely on the other side, watching, judging, hoping. Hoping for what? That one of their best was innocent? Or that he was just a simple broken man, not a monster who had been hiding in plain sight all along? Ethan didn't have the answer yet, but he knew the key wasn't in this room. It was out there, in the life Elijah and Simone Harris had built, a life that, from the outside, had looked so perfect. He just had to find the cracks. The Harris home was on a quiet, tree-lined street in Grant Park, a neighborhood of restored Victorian homes and meticulously manicured lawns. It was a picture of upper-middle-class black success in Atlanta, a carefully curated image of stability and aspiration. As Ethan Park pulled up to the curb, he saw a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine, a wide, welcoming porch with a swing, perfectly trimmed hedges, and a cheerful yellow front door. There was an American flag hanging by the entrance, its colors crisp and bright against the gray morning sky. It was the kind of house that projected an unshakable sense of peace. It was a lie. The entire property was sealed off with crime scene tape, a jarring slash of yellow against the home's serene facade. A uniformed officer stood guard, his presence a stark reminder that this perfect picture was now part of a murder investigation. Ethan spent the first hour walking through the house with the forensics team. Inside, it was just as immaculate as the outside. Hardwood floors gleamed, family photos lined the mantelpiece, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and vanilla. The photos told a story of a happy, successful couple, Elijah and Simone on their wedding day, beaming. Elijah in his crisp police uniform, shaking the mayor's hand. Simone holding up an award for her design work. Pictures from trips to Paris, to the Grand Canyon, to Martha's Vineyard. It was a public declaration of a perfect life. But Ethan had seen enough crime scenes to know that the happiest photos often hid the darkest secrets. He looked closer. In the more recent pictures, Simone's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Elijah often had a hand on her shoulder or her arm, a gesture that could be seen as affectionate, but also possessive, anchoring. "Find anything?" he asked the lead forensic tech. "Clean as a whistle, detective," the tech replied, dusting a coffee table for prints. No signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no weapons, no drugs. Just a normal house. But it felt too normal, too clean. It was the kind of organized that felt less like tidiness and more like control. In the master bedroom, the clothes in Simone's closet were arranged by color, a rainbow of precision. On Elijah's side, his old uniforms were pressed and hung in protective bags, relics of his ascent. On the nightstand, a single book lay on Simone's side, A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. On Elijah's, there was a copy of The Art of War. The contrast felt significant, a silent conversation between two fundamentally different worldviews. Leaving the sterile precision of the house, Ethan decided to talk to the neighbors. He started with the woman next door, an elderly widow named Mrs. Gable, who was watering her prize-winning roses, her movements slow and deliberate. She'd lived on this street for 50 years and had seen it all. "The Harrises," she said, her eyes sad. "Oh, they were just the perfect couple, a blessing to this neighborhood." She spoke of how Elijah would carry her groceries in from the car, and how Simone would bring over a slice of her famous peach cobbler on holidays. He was such a gentleman, so protective of her, always called her his queen. Protective. The word hung in the air. It was a word that could mean caring, but it could also mean something else entirely. "Did they ever fight, Mrs. Gable? Did you ever hear any arguments?" The old woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to her roses. "Well," she began slowly, "every couple has their spats, don't they? They were mostly quiet, not like the young people down the street with their loud music." She paused again, wrestling with a memory. "There was one time, though, maybe a month ago. I was in my garden, late in the evening. I didn't hear yelling. Not exactly. It was worse." "Worse how?" Ethan prompted. "It was quiet," she whispered, as if afraid of being overheard even now. A low, hissing sound, like a snake. It was his voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone. It was just dripping with anger, a cold anger. And then I heard something smash. Glass. Just one sharp sound. A few minutes later, his car tore out of the driveway like the devil himself was after him. A quiet hissing argument, a single violent sound. It was a stark contrast to the image of the perfect gentleman. It was the first deep crack in the facade. Ethan thanked her and moved across the street to a younger couple who were packing their kids into a minivan. The husband, a friendly man named Ben, was eager to talk. "Man, it's just unbelievable," he said, shaking his head. "Elijah was a role model for my sons, for the whole community. A black cop who was one of the good ones, you know? This is going to set us all back." His wife, Chloe, was quieter, her expression more troubled. When Ben went inside to grab a diaper bag, she leaned in closer to Ethan. "Can I tell you something? Off the record?" she asked, her voice low. "Anything you tell me could be important," Ethan replied. She took a deep breath. "Elijah, he gave me a weird vibe sometimes, like he was always performing, always on. And Simone, she'd changed over the last year. She used to be so bubbly, always organizing neighborhood potlucks. But lately, she was quiet, distant. She stopped coming to our book club." Chloe looked down at her hands. "Once we were having coffee on my porch, and his patrol car just appeared. He didn't get out. He just sat there at the end of the street, watching. When Simone saw him, all the color drained from her face. She made an excuse and left immediately. It was just creepy, like he was checking up on her. A silent, watching patrol car. A wife whose color drained at the sight of her husband. This wasn't protection. It was surveillance. It was control. The beautiful house with the yellow door suddenly seemed less like a home and more like an ornate cage. Elijah Harris wasn't just a husband, he was a warden. And Simone hadn't been his queen, she had been his prisoner. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, looking back at the Harris home. The crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, a fragile barrier between the public image and the private truth. He now understood that he wasn't just investigating a single act of violence that happened in a dark parking lot. He was unraveling a long, slow, and silent crime, one that had been happening for years behind that cheerful yellow door, hidden in plain sight. The smash of glass misses Gable heard wasn't just a broken object. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality beginning to shatter. And last night, in the rain-swept darkness, it had finally exploded. If Simone Harris had been a prisoner, her best friend Brianna was the one who had seen the bars on the cage. Ethan met her at a small, independent coffee shop in Midtown, a place with colorful murals and the rich scent of roasting beans. It was a neutral ground, a world away from the cold confines of a police station. Brianna was a tall, striking woman who worked as a curator at the High Museum of Art. She carried herself with an air of sophisticated confidence, but today, that confidence was a fragile veneer. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, and she clutched a ceramic mug of tea as if it were a lifeline. For the first 20 minutes, she spoke about Simone in the glowing, grief-stricken terms of a eulogy. She talked about their college days at Spelman, their shared dreams, the way Simone could find beauty in the most mundane things. She painted a picture of Simone's early years with Elijah as a whirlwind romance, a fairy tale. He swept her off her feet, Brianna said, a faint, sad smile on her lips. He was charming, ambitious, devoted. He made her feel safe. Safe. There was that word again. Ethan let her talk, knowing that grief needed an outlet before the harder truths could surface. He gently steered the conversation toward the present. When did things start to change? Brianna's smile vanished. She stared into her tea, her knuckles white around the mug. Change is too soft a word, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was more like an erosion. Slow at first. You barely notice it. Then one day you look up and realize half the foundation is gone. The erosion, she explained, began after Elijah received his first big promotion about 3 years ago. The public acclaim seemed to feed a private insecurity. He became obsessed with their image, Brianna said. The perfect black power couple. He controlled everything. The friends they saw, the events they attended, even the way she dressed. He'd say things like, "A detective's wife needs to look a certain way, Simone." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Simone, a free-spirited artist, began to shrink. She stopped wearing the bright bohemian clothes she loved and adopted a more conservative style. She drifted away from her more liberal-minded friends from the art world, the ones Elijah dismissed as unserious. Her world became smaller, its borders defined by her husband's expectations. He controlled the finances too, Brianna continued, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and rage. Simone was a brilliant designer, pulling in a great salary, but he convinced her to set up a joint account that he managed. He gave her an allowance. An allowance. Like she was a child. He called it smart financial planning. She called it a gilded cage. Ethan listened, his pen moving silently across his notepad. This was the classic pattern of coercive control, a form of domestic abuse that leaves no physical marks but devastates the soul. It was subtle, insidious, and brutally effective. Did it ever get physical, Brianna? She flinched, as if the question itself were a blow. She took a shaky breath and reached into her purse, pulling out her phone. After a moment of scrolling, she turned the screen toward Ethan. It was a photo from a 4th of July barbecue last summer, a group of friends smiling, holding drinks. Simone was in the center, wearing a beautiful sleeveless sundress, and there, high on her left arm, was a dark, ugly bruise in the distinct shape of a handprint. She told everyone she'd walked into a door frame, Brianna said, her voice thick with unshed tears. But later that night, she admitted the truth. They'd had an argument because she was talking too long with a male colleague from work. Elijah grabbed her. "He didn't hit me," she kept saying, as if that made it okay. "He just has a strong grip." Brianna looked up, her eyes meeting Ethan's. She was terrified, but she was also ashamed. How do you explain to the world that the city's hero, the perfect husband, is a monster behind closed doors? Who would believe her? The answer was no one. The system was designed to protect men like Elijah Harris. His badge, his reputation, his perfectly curated public image, they were all shields. Brianna swiped to another photo. This one was more recent, taken just a few weeks ago. Simone was wearing a long-sleeved turtleneck sweater, despite the warm Atlanta spring day. This became her new uniform, Brianna said bitterly. She was always cold, she'd say, always covering up. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Simone wasn't just unhappy. She was actively planning her escape. She was saving money, Brianna revealed, her voice barely audible. She'd been taking on freelance design projects on the side, funneling the money into a private account he didn't know about. She had almost enough to get her own place. She was just waiting for the right moment. She was scared of what he would do if he found out. And then came the most devastating revelation of all. Devin Hayes, the other victim. He wasn't just some random affair, Brianna explained. Simone met him through a volunteer project. He was everything Elijah wasn't. He listened to her. He saw her, not the officer's wife. He encouraged her art, her dreams. He made her feel like herself again. Brianna finally broke, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't in love with him, not yet, but she was falling in love with the idea of who she could be when she was with him. He represented hope, freedom. Devin Hayes wasn't the cause of the marriage's collapse. He was a symptom of it. He was the lifeboat Simone was swimming toward. But Elijah hadn't seen a lifeboat. He'd seen a threat to his control, a witness to his failure. And in his world, threats had to be eliminated. Ethan left the coffee shop feeling a cold weight settle in his chest. He now had the motive. It wasn't a sudden, passionate crime. It was the final, desperate act of a tyrant losing his kingdom. Elijah Harris hadn't snapped. He had enforced his rule in the only way he had left. The image of Simone in her turtleneck sweater, covering her bruises, covering her fear, haunted him. Her silence had been a scream for help that no one had been able to hear. And now, that silence was permanent. The public narrative was already taking shape, molded by early news leaks and the city's insatiable appetite for scandal. In this simplistic, ugly telling, there were three characters: the fallen hero cop, the unfaithful wife, and the homewrecker. Devin Hayes was being cast in the last, most thankless role. He was becoming a shadow, a faceless catalyst for the tragedy. Ethan knew that, to solve this case, he had to give that shadow a face. He found Devin's family in a modest but proud home in the historic Sweet Auburn district, a cradle of the civil rights movement. The air in the small living room was thick with grief. Devin's mother, a formidable woman named Althea Hayes, sat straight-backed on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. His father stood by the window, staring out at the street where his son used to play. A younger sister wept silently in an armchair. On the wall, photos of Devin chronicled a life of purpose. Devin at his Morehouse College graduation, Devin building a community garden, Devin leading a group of teenagers on a hike. "They're going to drag his name through the mud, aren't they, Detective?" Althea asked, her voice low but clear, without a trace of self-pity. It was the voice of a woman who had seen the world for what it was and was not surprised by its cruelty. "They'll make my son out to be some kind of predator. They'll say he went after a married woman. They'll do anything to protect that man, that officer, because he wears a badge." Ethan met her gaze. "It's my job to find the truth, Mrs. Hayes, the whole truth. That includes who your son was." And so, they told him. Devin Hayes wasn't a homewrecker. He was a builder. He had a degree in urban planning and had turned down lucrative corporate offers to work for a non-profit that helped underserved youth in Atlanta. He spent his evenings and weekends mentoring, coaching, and organizing. He believed in the power of community, in the potential of kids that society had written off. He met Simone Harris at a fundraiser for our youth center, his father explained, his voice rough with emotion. She was volunteering to design the promotional materials, free of charge. Devin said he'd never met anyone with such a sad fire in her eyes. Sad fire? The description was perfect. "Did he know she was married to a police officer?" Ethan asked. "He did," Althea confirmed, and it worried him. Not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he knew how things could look. Devin was a realist. He knew he was a black man in Georgia. He knew the rules were different for him. Their relationship, the family insisted, was not some sordid affair. It was a friendship born of shared ideals that was slowly, cautiously, blossoming into something more. Devin had become Simone's confidant, the one person she could tell about the suffocation of her marriage. He wasn't luring her away, he was encouraging her to save herself. He told her she deserved to be happy, his sister whispered through her tears. He was helping her look for apartments. He was just trying to help. He was a good Samaritan, and his reward had been 3 bullets. As Ethan was leaving, Althea stopped him at the door. "Detective," she said, her eyes boring into him. "That officer, Elijah Harris, he was held up as a hero to our boys, a role model, proof that you could be black and wear a badge and still be one of us. What do we tell those boys now? That the hero is a killer? That the system we told them to trust is just as broken as they feared?" Her questions hung in the air long after he'd driven away. They were at the heart of the storm this case was about to unleash on the city. This wasn't just a domestic homicide anymore. It was a cultural and racial flashpoint. The pressure was mounting. Back at headquarters, Captain Miller called Ethan into his office. Miller was a white, old-school cop who had seen the city through riots, protests, and accusations of corruption. He was a political animal, skilled at navigating the treacherous currents of his job. "The mayor's office has been calling all morning," Miller said, leaning back in his chair. "The media is spinning this as a crime of passion, tragic but understandable. They want to contain this, Park. Keep it a simple domestic dispute." "It's not that simple, Captain," Ethan stated. "This is about long-term abuse and control." "I know what it's about," Miller cut in, his tone sharp. "But what it's about and what we say it's about are 2 different things. We've got a dead black community leader, a dead wife, and a black hero cop as the killer. Every activist group in the city is about to be on our doorstep. This thing could explode." He leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Elijah Harris was one of ours. He was a good cop. We need to handle this delicately. Don't go turning this into a crusade about domestic abuse. You find the evidence, you build your case for murder, and you keep the wider narrative out of it. Do you understand me?" Ethan understood perfectly. The command was clear: protect the department's image, minimize the fallout. The blue wall wasn't just about protecting a brother in arms. It was about protecting the institution itself. Miller was asking him to frame the picture narrowly, to crop out the uncomfortable truths about the culture that had allowed a man like Elijah to hide his darkness behind a shiny badge. He walked out of the captain's office with the weight of Althea Hayes' questions heavy on his shoulders. He was caught between 2 worlds: the grieving family that demanded the whole, ugly truth, and the powerful department that wanted a tidier, less damaging version of it. The path of least resistance was to follow orders, to present a simple case of jealousy and rage. But as he thought of Simone's bruises and Devin's sad fire, he knew he couldn't. The truth wasn't delicate. It was brutal. And it deserved to be told, no matter how many walls had to come crashing down. In modern homicide investigations, the dead leave behind ghosts. These ghosts live in the cold, glowing circuits of their cell phones, in the digital trails of their text messages, emails, and location data. It was Ethan Park's job to resurrect these ghosts and listen to their stories. The forensics lab had finally broken the encryption on the phones belonging to Simone, Devin, and Elijah. The data was downloaded, printed, and compiled into 3 thick binders that now sat on Ethan's desk. It was time to let the dead speak. He started with the correspondence between Simone and Devin. As Brianna had suggested, their conversation began professionally, discussing logos and color schemes for the youth center. But within a few weeks, the tone shifted. It became more personal, more intimate. They shared articles, recommended books, and talked about their dreams. It was a conversation of minds, a slow-building emotional connection that felt miles away from a cheap affair. Simone: "Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a role in a play that someone else wrote for me." Devin: "Then it's time to write your own script. You're the only author that matters." Ethan could feel the lifeline Devin was throwing her. He wasn't a predator. He was an editor, helping her find her own voice. Their plans to meet on the night of the murder were laid out in plain text. It wasn't a clandestine hookup. Simone had a new freelance client in that part of town and was going to show Devin the initial designs. The desolate part of the parking lot wasn't for secrecy. It was because she knew it would be empty and they could talk in peace without being interrupted. A fatal miscalculation. Next, Ethan opened the binder containing the messages between Simone and her husband. The contrast was jarring. Their texts from the past 6 months were terse, functional, and devoid of any affection. They were logistical exchanges about groceries, bills, and schedules. Elijah, where are you? Simone. Out with Brianna. Elijah. You didn't mention that this morning. Simone. It was a last-minute thing. I'll be home soon. Reading them, Ethan felt a chill. Elijah's messages were less like questions and more like interrogations. He was constantly demanding her location, questioning her timeline, probing for inconsistencies. It was the digital footprint of his coercive control. Simone's replies were brief, cautious, and defensive. She was a witness on a stand, constantly under cross-examination. But the most damning evidence wasn't in what they said. It was in the data buried deep within Elijah's phone. A junior tech, a kid with a knack for digging, had found it. "Detective, you need to see this," he'd said, his voice buzzing with excitement. On the screen was the interface for a piece of sophisticated spyware, a ghost app. It had been installed on Elijah's phone 3 months prior and synced to Simone's device without her knowledge. It tracked her every move via her phone's GPS. It logged her calls. It even had a key logging function that captured her text messages and search history. Elijah Harris hadn't just been suspicious. He'd been conducting a 24/7 surveillance operation on his own wife. The tech brought up a map of Atlanta, a spiderweb of red lines tracking Simone's movements over the past several weeks. Ethan watched as her ghost drove across the city. There were her trips to her sister's house, her yoga studio, the art supply store. There were also trips she hadn't told Elijah about, trips to the coffee shop to meet Brianna, trips to the library where she'd sit and read for hours, alone. And then Ethan saw it, a single data point from 2 days before the murder that made his blood run cold. The red line of Simone's car traveled to a law firm in Midtown, a firm that specialized in one thing, high-conflict divorce. She had done it. She had taken the final, definitive step. She had gone to see a lawyer. Elijah, with his all-seeing spyware, would have known the instant she parked her car. He would have known his control was about to be shattered. This wasn't a crime of passion, a sudden snap in a parking lot. It was a calculated execution. He had discovered her escape plan and decided to preempt it with brutal finality. The blackout defense was now officially dead. A man who installs spyware and monitors his wife's every move is not a man who loses control. He is a man obsessed with it. The sight of her with Devin wasn't a shocking revelation. It was merely the confirmation of his paranoid fears, the final excuse he needed to unleash the rage that had been simmering for months. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He felt a grim satisfaction, the kind a detective feels when a key piece of the puzzle slides into place. But it was overshadowed by a profound sadness. He could picture Simone sitting in that lawyer's office, a flicker of hope in her eyes, finally believing she could be free. She had no idea her every move was being watched by the very man she was trying to escape. Her digital ghost was screaming a warning, but she couldn't hear it. He picked up the phone to call Captain Miller. There would be no more talk of handling this delicately. He now had the digital proof of premeditation. It was cold, hard, and undeniable. He had the weapon, the motive, and the timeline. But as he looked at the map of Simone's final days, he noticed something else. The GPS data from the night of the murder showed her arriving at the mall at 9:30 p.m. Elijah's patrol car, according to his own vehicle's GPS, was on the other side of the city in Zone 3, just as he'd claimed. He didn't arrive at the scene until 10:15 p.m., just minutes before the shooting. That meant, for 45 minutes, Simone and Devin were alone in that parking lot. What happened during that time? Was there anything else Elijah could have seen or known? Ethan had a feeling there was still one more piece missing, something that wasn't stored on a server or a hard drive, something that was still out there, hidden in the mud and rain of the crime scene itself. A successful homicide investigation is a battle against entropy. Detectives and forensic specialists work to impose order on chaos, to piece together a coherent narrative from the violent fragmentation of a crime scene. But sometimes, the chaos fights back. A piece of evidence goes missing. A witness disappears. A detail refuses to fit. For Detective Ethan Park, that detail was a small brass cylinder, no bigger than his pinky finger. The fourth shell casing. The ballistics report was clear. Elijah Harris's service weapon, a Glock 19, had been fired 4 times. The medical examiner confirmed it, 2 rounds in Simone, 2 in Devon. The forensics team had recovered 3 9mm shell casings from inside and around the Honda Civic, but the 4th was gone. It was a small discrepancy, but in a case this sensitive, small discrepancies could grow into gaping holes for a defense attorney to exploit. A jury might wonder, if the scene was so secure, where did the 4th casing go? What else was missed? Ethan stood at the edge of the crime scene, which was still cordoned off. The mall parking lot had returned to its mundane rhythm, but this one corner remained a scar, a patch of forbidden ground. He reread the initial witness statements. The 2 teenagers in the car nearby had heard 4 distinct shots. Pop, 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 in quick succession. After the shooting, they said Elijah had stumbled back from the car, sat down on the curb, and waited. He didn't appear to move from that spot until the first patrol car arrived. So, where was the casing? A semi-automatic pistol ejects casings to the right and slightly rearward. Based on Elijah's likely position, the 4th casing should have landed on the asphalt near the others. It wasn't there. Ethan's team had done a grid search, crawling on their hands and knees with high-powered flashlights. Nothing. They'd swept the area with metal detectors. Nothing. It didn't make sense unless it wasn't a mistake. What if Elijah, in the few minutes between the killings and the arrival of the first officers, had done something? His mind might have been a white noise of rage, but some part of the veteran cop inside him could have taken over. Muscle memory, to training, an instinct to control the scene. Ethan walked over to the dense thicket of trees and kudzu that bordered the parking lot. It was a dark, tangled mess of undergrowth, still damp from the previous night's rain. The ground was a soft carpet of mud and decaying leaves. If you wanted to make something disappear, this was the place to do it. He threw it, Ethan said aloud to himself. After the shooting, he picked one up and threw it into the woods. It was more than a guess. It was a theory rooted in psychology. Why just one? Picking up all 4 would look like a clear attempt to sanitize the scene. But picking up and discarding one casing was different. It was a small act of chaos, an injection of doubt. It was the kind of thing a cop would do, someone who knows how investigations work, how doubt is sown. It was a conscious act, and if he was conscious enough to do that, he was conscious enough to remember everything. The blackout story was looking thinner by the minute. He called Captain Miller. "I need a search team, Captain, and I want to bring in a K9 unit, the best one we have." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. A K9 unit for a single shell casing? Park, that's a lot of resources for a piece of evidence that we don't strictly need. We have the gun, the bullets in the victims, and 3 other casings. "It's not about the casing itself, sir," Ethan argued, his voice firm. "It's about the act. If I can prove he consciously disposed of evidence, his whole blackout defense evaporates. It proves intent. It proves he was thinking." Miller sighed, a sound of weary resignation. He knew Ethan was right. He also knew the political headache of extending the search, of keeping the media focused on the crime scene. "Fine," he grumbled. "You've got until noon tomorrow. After that, we open this area back up. I can't keep a public space locked down forever." The next morning, the air was cool and crisp. The search team assembled at the edge of the woods. They were joined by Officer Jenkins, a stern, quiet woman who was the handler for the department's top scent dog. A magnificent German shepherd named Law. Law was a legend in the APD. He'd found missing children, tracked fugitives through the swamps south of the city, and sniffed out everything from narcotics to buried currency. His sense of smell could detect the unique metallic signature of gunpowder residue, even after a rain. Jenkins gave Law a command, and the dog went to work. He moved with a low, intense focus, his nose hovering just above the ground, his tail rigid. The human officers followed, trying to keep pace as the dog plunged into the dense undergrowth. For hours they searched. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them. The woods were humid and buzzing with insects. Hope began to wane. Maybe Ethan's theory was wrong. Maybe the casing had simply bounced under another car that had since left the scene. Then Law stopped. He was near the base of a large, gnarled oak tree, about 30 feet from the parking lot's edge. He let out a single, sharp bark and began to dig frantically at a patch of wet leaves, his paws sending clumps of mud flying. Jenkins rushed to his side. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" Ethan and the other officers converged on the spot. Jenkins knelt and carefully brushed away the leaves and dirt where Law had been digging. There it was. Glistening in a patch of sunlight, caked in mud but unmistakable, was the 4th 9mm shell casing. A wave of relief washed over Ethan. His theory was correct. His case was now ironclad. But Law wasn't finished. The dog let out another excited bark and moved a few feet away, pawing at another spot. He was whining now, insistent. "He's got something else," Jenkins said, her brow furrowed in confusion. Gunpowder residue was one thing, but what else could be out here? Ethan knelt beside the second spot. The ground was soft and disturbed. He carefully dug into the damp earth with his gloved hands. He felt something soft, papery, and brittle. He pulled it out. It was a small, charred mass, the remains of something that had been burned. As he gently broke a piece of it apart, he could see the faint blue lines of ruled paper and the ghostly trace of feminine handwriting. It was the corner of a page from a small notebook or a diary. Elijah hadn't just thrown the casing. He had stopped here, in the moments after murdering 2 people, to burn something. He had tried to destroy a story. Ethan now knew his job wasn't just to find the missing casing, but to figure out what secrets were written in the ashes. The discovery of the charred remains transformed the investigation. The 4th shell casing had been the missing piece of the physical puzzle, but this was a fragment of the soul of the case. Back in the sterile environment of the forensics lab, a specialist worked with the patience of an archaeologist, gently separating the fragile, burnt pages. The fire had done its work well. Most of the notebook was irreparable ash and carbon, but a few corner pieces and some tightly packed inner pages had survived, shielded from the full force of the flames. Slowly, painstakingly, a story began to emerge from the wreckage. It was Simone's handwriting, a graceful, looping script that Ethan now recognized from notes on the kitchen calendar in her home. It was a diary, a secret diary. The surviving fragments were a mosaic of her pain, her fear, and her burgeoning hope. One legible page, dated 2 weeks before her death, read, "He doesn't look at me anymore. He looks through me. Or he watches me. I feel like a specimen under glass. I have to measure every word, every smile. The silence in our house is so loud it screams. I think the man I married is gone, and a stranger is living in his place." Another fragment, blistered and brown from the heat, was even more chilling. "Brianna says I should just leave, just pack a bag and go. But she doesn't understand. It's not the leaving that's hard, it's the fear of being followed. He told me once, laughing, that he could find me anywhere on earth. It didn't sound like a joke, it sounded like a promise." It was a portrait of a woman living in a state of psychological siege. The diary was her only safe space, the one place she could be honest without fear of reprisal, and Elijah had found it. The timeline started to form in Ethan's mind. He imagined Elijah, consumed by paranoia, searching the car after he'd killed its occupants. Perhaps he was looking for a phone, for letters, for any proof to justify his rage. And he had found this diary instead. He had found her innermost thoughts, her fears of him, her plans to leave, her budding feelings for Devon. He had read the testament of his own failure as a husband and a man. And then, in a final act of control, a final act of silencing her, he had set it on fire. He hadn't just killed her body. He had tried to obliterate her soul, her story. The existence of the diary, and his attempt to destroy it, was the nail in the coffin of his blackout defense. The act of burning it was meticulous. It required a lighter, time, and a clear, focused intent. This was not the work of a man lost in a fog of rage. This was the cold, deliberate act of an executioner cleaning up his crime. Armed with this new, devastating evidence, Ethan knew it was time for his second conversation with Elijah Harris. This would not be an interview. It would be a confrontation. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was different this time. The false cordiality was gone. Ethan didn't offer coffee. He didn't start with small talk. He walked in, sat down, and placed a single evidence bag in the center of the metal table. Inside it were the charred, pathetic remains of Simone's diary. Elijah stared at the bag, and for the first time, the mask of hollow shock cracked. A flicker of pure, undiluted panic flashed in his eyes before he could suppress it. He knew what it was. "We found this in the woods next to the parking lot, Elijah," Ethan said, his voice flat and cold as steel. "We found it right next to the fourth shell casing, the one you thought you'd made disappear." Elijah remained silent, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle pulsed in his cheek. "We also found the spyware on your phone," Ethan continued, his voice relentless. "We know you were tracking her. We know you followed her to a divorce attorney's office 2 days before you killed her. The blackout story is over. It's done." He let the words hang in the air, a final, undeniable indictment. He watched as the fight visibly drained out of Elijah. His broad shoulders, which had been held rigid with defiance, slumped forward. The fortress he had built around himself had been breached, its walls pulverized. "You read it, didn't you?" Ethan pressed, his voice softer now, not with sympathy, but with a clinical curiosity. "After you shot her, you found her diary in the car. You stood there, in the rain, next to the bodies of your wife and her friend, and you read her final thoughts, and then you tried to burn her voice out of existence. Tell me, Elijah, what did you feel when you read her words?" Elijah finally looked up. His eyes were no longer vacant. They were filled with a terrifying cocktail of emotions: self-pity, rage, and a profound, bottomless grief. The dam of his denial finally broke, and the truth came flooding out, ugly and raw. "She called me a stranger," he whispered, his voice cracking, "in my own home. She wrote about him, about Devin, how he made her feel seen." Seen? What about me? I gave her everything: a beautiful home, a safe life. I was a hero to this city, and it wasn't enough for her. He was no longer the shocked victim of his own rage. He was a petulant tyrant, bemoaning the rebellion of his most prized subject. "So you killed her," Ethan stated, the words hanging between them like a death sentence. "I didn't." Elijah started, then stopped. The lie died on his lips. He took a ragged breath. "I had to make her listen. I had to make her understand that she couldn't just throw us away." And then he revealed something unexpected, a piece of his own story that he had kept buried, a vulnerability he never showed to the world. "You don't know what it's like, Park," he said, his voice dropping, a strange intimacy entering his tone. "To be me, to be the good one, the one everyone points to. At the precinct, I've got guys on my own shift, white cops, who make jokes behind my back, who second-guess my calls. I've had my own supervisor pull my file to double-check my reports in a way he never does with the white officers. I have to be twice as good, twice as tough, just to be seen as equal." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "The job? It was a pressure cooker. The one place I thought I had control, the one place I was the king, was my home, with my family, with her. And she was taking that away from me, too. She was disrespecting me, just like they do." It wasn't an excuse, but it was a glimpse into the tangled, toxic roots of his rage. His need for control at home was a direct reaction to the powerlessness and prejudice he faced at work. He had become the very thing he hated, an oppressor ruling his own tiny kingdom with fear because he felt so threatened by the world outside. The hero of Atlanta was a man being crushed by the weight of his own myth. He had killed his wife not just because of what she did, but because of who he needed her to be, the one person in the world who would never, ever challenge his authority. And she had. So, he had erased her. The confession, when it finally came, was not a sudden dam break, but a slow, leaking erosion of lies. Stripped of his blackout defense by the damning evidence of the spyware and the burned diary, Elijah Harris began to talk. But it wasn't the cathartic outpouring of a remorseful man. It was the calculated narrative of a man trying to reframe his own monstrosity, to paint himself not as a villain, but as a victim, a tragic hero pushed beyond his limits. "It was the disrespect," he kept repeating, the word becoming a mantra. He spoke of the subtle and not so subtle racism he endured within the APD, a topic that made the department brass observing behind the one-way mirror shift uncomfortably. He described being passed over for a special assignment in favor of a less experienced white officer. He recounted being called one of the good ones by a city councilman, a phrase meant as a compliment that felt like a knife, separating him from his own community. "I swallowed it all," Elijah said, his voice laced with a bitter poison. "I smiled, I did the community outreach, I posed for the cameras, I played the part they wrote for me, because that's what you have to do. You have to be perfect. Any crack, any mistake, and they'll tear you down." Ethan listened, letting him build his case. He understood the pressure Elijah was describing. He'd felt his own version of it as an Asian American cop in the South. But he also knew it was a deflection, a clever piece of misdirection. Elijah was trying to put the system on trial to distract from his own personal tyranny. "So, the pressure from the job, it followed you home?" Ethan prompted. "You're damn right it did," Elijah spat. "Home was supposed to be the one place where I didn't have to fight, the one place I was in charge, where I was respected." He looked at Ethan, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Simone, she knew that. She knew what I was going through. And she started pulling away anyway. She started keeping secrets, whispering on the phone, coming home late. It was like she was joining them, the people who were trying to tear me down. The paranoia was palpable. In his mind, his wife's bid for independence was not a personal journey. It was a personal betrayal, an act of treason. Her desire for freedom was an attack on his authority. Ethan steered him back to the night of the murder. "Tell me about the spyware, Elijah. When did you decide to install it?" "About 3 months ago," he admitted, with a shrug that was meant to be casual but looked anything but. She was getting distant. "I had a right to know why. I'm her husband." There was no shame in his voice, only a chilling sense of entitlement. He believed his fear gave him the right to violate her privacy, to strip her of any semblance of a private life. "And it led you to the divorce attorney's office," Ethan said. Elijah's face darkened. "I saw that. I saw her car parked right outside. I felt cold, like the world was ending. All my work, everything I'd built, our life, our image, she was going to burn it to the ground. For what? So she could run off with some community organizer?" The sneer in his voice when he said the words was thick with contempt. He couldn't even grant his rival a title worthy of respect. "So you went to the mall that night, knowing she would be there with him?" "No," Elijah insisted, shaking his head. "I didn't know he'd be there. The app just showed her at the mall. I was going to confront her, to talk to her, to make her see reason." "Make her see reason?" Ethan repeated the phrase. "Or make her obey?" Elijah didn't answer. He just stared at his hands. "Walk me through it, Elijah, from the moment you got out of your patrol car." He took a deep, shuddering breath, and for the first time, the story came out in a linear, coherent sequence. The blackout was gone. The fog had lifted. In its place was a memory of terrifying clarity. "I saw them in the car," he began, his voice low and strained. "They weren't doing anything. They were just talking. But she was laughing, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from her in years. And she touched his arm." He paused, the memory twisting his face into a mask of pain. It was such a small thing, a touch on the arm. But it broke me. It was like watching a stranger be intimate with my wife. I pulled open the driver's side door. The man, Devin, he looked up, surprised. Not scared at first, just confused. Simone, she saw me, and her face, it was pure terror. She knew. What did she know, Elijah? "She knew she had crossed a line she couldn't come back from," he said, his voice turning hard again, the self-pity replaced by a cold fury. "She screamed my name. I told her to be quiet. I told him to get out of the car. He started to say something like, 'Man, we're just talking.' He was trying to de-escalate, but all I could hear was disrespect." He looked up at Ethan, his eyes hollow. My hand went to my gun. It was like it moved on its own. All that training, all those years on the range, it just took over. I saw him as a threat. I neutralized the threat. He used the clinical language of law enforcement to describe the murder of an unarmed man. It was chilling. And Simone? Ethan asked quietly. Elijah's face crumpled. For the first time, genuine tears welled in his eyes. She was screaming, just screaming. I just wanted it to stop. I just wanted the noise to stop. He fired the gun to silence the sound of his own failure. He confessed to everything then. To shooting Devin first, then Simone. To his mind going eerily calm in the aftermath. To finding the diary in her purse. To walking into the woods to burn it. A final, futile attempt to erase the truth. To picking up one shell casing and flinging it into the darkness. A last desperate act of a cop's mind trying to muddy the waters. The blue wall had completely crumbled. Behind it was not a hero or a monster, but something far more common and terrifying. A man so consumed by his own insecurity, so addicted to control, that he would rather destroy the thing he claimed to love than risk losing it. His confession wasn't an act of remorse. It was a final performance, a last attempt to control the narrative of his own downfall. He had failed to control his wife in life, so he had controlled her in death, and now he was trying to control the reason why. With the confession recorded, the case against Elijah Harris was sealed. The legal battle would come later, with motions and arguments over his state of mind. But the foundational truth was now on the record, undeniable and horrific. Ethan Park's job was nearly done. All that remained was the grim paperwork, the formal closing of a file that represented the violent end of 2 lives and the complete detonation of a third. But one detail from Elijah's confession gnawed at him. My hand went to my gun. It was like it moved on its own. This phrase, this attempt to abdicate responsibility and blame muscle memory, was a common refrain among officers who crossed the line. It was a way of separating the man from the action, of suggesting that the training, the uniform, the gun itself held a separate, darker agency. Ethan knew it was a lie, but it was a lie that pointed to a deeper, more troubling truth about the culture that had shaped Elijah Harris. He sought out Brianna one last time, not as a detective seeking evidence, but as a man trying to understand the final pieces of the human story. He met her at Simone's art studio, a bright, airy loft space that she had rented just 6 months ago, a fact she had kept hidden from Elijah. It was her sanctuary, her one true space of freedom. The room was filled with unfinished canvases, vibrant splashes of color, and bold, abstract shapes. It was a testament to the life and creativity that had been extinguished. He said the gun moved on its own, Ethan told her quietly as they stood amidst Simone's work. Brianna let out a short, bitter laugh. Nothing Elijah ever did was by accident, she said, running a hand over a canvas streaked with brilliant blues and golds. His entire life was about control. Every movement, every word was calculated. He didn't lose control that night. He exercised the ultimate form of it. She walked over to a locked flat file cabinet in the corner and opened it with a key from her purse. Simone gave me this for safekeeping, she said. She pulled out a large portfolio. Inside wasn't artwork, but documents. Printouts of emails between Elijah and his supervisor, copies of shift schedules, notes Simone had taken, documenting incidents of Elijah coming home in a rage after a difficult shift, of him punching walls, of him meticulously cleaning his service weapon for hours on end while giving her the silent treatment. Simone hadn't just been planning to leave. She had been building a case. She was documenting his instability, his volatility. The trip to the divorce lawyer wasn't just an initial consultation. She had been preparing to file for a restraining order, using his position as an officer and his access to weapons as grounds for her fear for her safety. She knew he was a ticking time bomb, Brianna said, her voice thick with emotion. She saw the pressure cooker he was in, the racism at work, the obsession with his public image, but she also knew it wasn't an excuse. It was just an explanation. She told me, the job didn't make him a monster. It just gave his monster a badge and a gun. That was the awful truth. The police department, the city that had elevated him, hadn't created the darkness inside Elijah Harris, but it had nurtured it. It had provided him with the tools of power and authority, rewarded his aggression, and wrapped him in a cloak of heroism that made him feel untouchable. It had created an environment where his need for control was seen as a virtue, until it wasn't. Ethan thought back to his final exchange with Elijah as he was being led out of the interrogation room, his confession complete. Elijah had stopped, his face a wreck of self-pity and confusion. "I don't understand," he'd whispered, his eyes searching Ethan's for an answer. "I did everything right. I became a cop to protect people, to be a good guy. When did I become the bad guy?" He was so steeped in his own narrative that he genuinely couldn't see the chasm between his public persona and his private actions. He had spent so many years playing the hero that he had lost sight of the man. The bad guy hadn't emerged in that parking lot. He had been there all along, hiding behind the badge, festering in the silence of a perfect home, nourished by a deep-seated fear of losing control. The shooting wasn't the moment he became a monster. It was simply the moment the monster took off its mask. His final words during the official confession were the most chilling. After detailing the murders in a flat monotone, he was asked if he had anything else to add. He was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "When I saw them in the car, all I could think was, she's making me look weak. My wife was making me look weak." That was it. In the end, it wasn't about love or even jealousy. It was about pride. It was about his image. The lives of Simone Harris and Devin Hayes were extinguished, not for what they did, but for what their connection represented. A threat to the fragile, carefully constructed myth of Officer Elijah Harris. He had murdered two people to protect a fiction. Ethan left the art studio, the vibrant colors of Simone's canvases burned into his memory. He now had the full, devastating picture, a man driven by a toxic mix of insecurity, professional pressure, and an obsessive need for control. A woman who had seen the monster clearly and was methodically planning her escape. A good man who offered her a hand in friendship and paid for it with his life. It was a tragedy born not in a single moment of rage, but forged over years of silent abuse, hidden fears, and the dangerous illusion of a perfect life. The gun didn't have a life of its own. Elijah had simply given it permission to do what he had wanted to do all along. In the end, the legal system did its job. With an ironclad confession and a mountain of corroborating evidence, the trial of Elijah Harris was swift. The defense's attempts to paint him as a man who snapped under immense psychological pressure were dismantled by the prosecution's clear timeline of premeditation, the spyware, the visit to the divorce lawyer, the burned diary. The jury took less than 4 hours to find him guilty of 2 counts of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Justice, in its formal, procedural sense, had been served. Detective Ethan Park sat in his office late one night, weeks after the verdict. The Elijah Harris case file, now several volumes thick, lay closed on his desk. The city had moved on, as cities do. The headlines had been replaced by new scandals, new tragedies. The name Elijah Harris, once a symbol of hope and heroism, was now a cautionary tale, a whisper of shame within the APD. Captain Miller had followed through on his promise to handle the fallout. An internal review was conducted. New protocols for officer wellness and mental health support were announced in a carefully worded press conference. It was the familiar dance of institutional damage control. Acknowledge the problem just enough to appease the public, but not so much that it requires fundamental change. The blue wall, cracked but not broken, had been patched up with policy memos and PR statements. But for Ethan, the case wasn't closed. It lived on in the echoes, in the quiet moments when he would find his mind drifting back to the case's unresolved questions. He thought of Althea Hayes and her painful query. What do we tell the boys now? He didn't have an answer. The story of Elijah Harris was a terrible paradox. He was both a victim of a racist system and the perpetrator of a horrific crime. He was a man who fought for justice on the streets while cultivating tyranny in his own home. To tell the whole truth was to embrace that complexity, to admit that heroes and monsters can, and often do, reside in the same skin. He thought of Devin Hayes, a man of peace and principle, whose life was ended by a man of law and order. His death left a void in the community he served, a reminder that the violence of one man's private rage can have devastating public consequences. Most of all, he thought of Simone. He thought of her art studio, a vibrant sanctuary of a life she was trying to build. He thought of her quiet, methodical courage in documenting her husband's abuse, in saving money, in seeking legal help. She had done everything right. She had fought for her freedom not with anger, but with intelligence and foresight. Her only mistake was underestimating the depths of her husband's obsession, his willingness to destroy everything rather than let her go. The lesson of this case, Ethan concluded, was not simple. It was not just about the dangers of jealousy or the importance of spotting the signs of domestic abuse. It was about the corrosive nature of secrets and the destructive power of the facades we build. Elijah Harris had been so invested in his public image as a perfect hero that he couldn't bear the private reality of being a flawed man. His home, with its gleaming floors and happy photos, was not a home. It was a stage set. And when one of his co-stars decided to walk off the stage, he brought the whole theater crashing down. The story also served as a stark reminder of the insidious nature of coercive control. The most dangerous abuse isn't always the loudest. It's the quiet, hissing arguments in the dark. It's the surveillance disguised as concern. It's the allowance given to a grown woman. It's the slow, methodical erosion of a person's soul, which often precedes the final, violent destruction of their body. Ethan looked out his window at the glittering skyline of Atlanta. Down below, in thousands of homes, behind thousands of doors, similar stories were unfolding in silence. Not all would end in bloodshed, but the quiet suffering, the hidden fear, was a tragedy in itself. The impenetrable blue wall was just a metaphor for the walls people build in their own lives, walls of denial and shame that prevent them from seeking or offering help. He finally stood up, turned off his desk lamp, and prepared to go home. The case was over, but its weight would stay with him. It was a reminder that the most important clues are not always found at the crime scene, but in the subtle dynamics of a relationship. It was a reminder that evil is often mundane, born from common human failings like pride, insecurity, and fear. And it was a sobering confirmation of a truth he had learned long ago in his line of work. The most terrifying monsters are not strangers who leap from the shadows, but the ones who smile at us from across the dinner table, the ones we invite into our homes and into our hearts, never knowing the darkness they hide until it's far too late. The silence they leave behind is the most damning evidence of all.